Good morning and welcome to the first of four workshops or sessions on TNFD that RIAA is really pleased to be running in collaboration with the Australian Government. My name's Estelle Parker. I'm the Executive Manager of Programs at RIAA, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for this morning's session. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri country, where, according to the 7 seasons or so of the Wurundjeri calendar, we are just entering Gunyang season, which is kangaroo apple season. This is where we are bringing some unpredictable warm weather, often with thunder and rain, where the days are long and the nights are becoming much shorter and the fruit starts to appear on the kangaroo apple bushes. As I said, Gunyang season is one of the 7 seasons that guide the Wurundjeri people through the year. I'd like to pay my respects to those who have looked after these lands and waters for countless seasons, and to all First Nations elders past and present of all the lands that we're dialing in from today. I note as well, we do have a number of people coming in from New Zealand across the ditch. Kia ora to you. So why are we doing this? Well, first of all, it's wonderful to see the Australian federal government remaining so engaged in TNFD, really understanding the importance of this framework to meet our national goals and targets around biodiversity protection. So what we want to do through these workshops is really to demystify the piloting process of TNFD and really give an understanding of what reporting against the framework involves from a practical perspective. So today's session is going to be focused on that. We're going to talk a lot about the different ways to pilot, and hopefully this will give you the tools to help make the business case for TNFD reporting within your organisation and your investee companies as well, for those investors who are joining us today. Inform you about TNFD developments and approaches to implementation. And we really want, in the end, corporate entities from a really broad range of sectors to have the knowledge and understanding of TNFD as a framework for nature-related reporting. We are sort of, I guess, presuming that you have a basic understanding of TNFD. So we're not going to start from the very beginning about what Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures is, why it was established and so on, but we really want to get in today to the nitty-gritty of what piloting involves. So today's agenda, that's a full agenda. We're going to start by talking about where we are in the process of TNFD, looking at the beta framework, what the updates are to the framework since the launch of version 0.3 a couple of weeks ago, and also what lies ahead for version 0.4. And that's with Guy Williams, who is very closely involved in the TNFD task force. And he's also going to take us through some of the different options for piloting. That is, what are the different ways that organisations can pilot the framework. Then we're going to do a deep dive into a fantastic case study from Blackmores. So we're really fortunate to have Sally Townsend, the Head of Sustainability for Blackmores, and also Laura Waterford from Pollination. They've been working together to do the piloting that Blackmores has been doing. Then we, of course, have a scientist, Jay Hender, who's the Head of Natural Capital from Climate Friendly. He's going to talk about how nature is measured, what are the options for minimising impact and so on, and really looking at demystifying the science of TNFD. And then we are going to hear from the person who's leading the federal government's involvement in TNFD, Ari Cowling, from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. And then at the end, we'll have some time for discussion, but I do note we are going to have some opportunities to ask questions throughout this webinar. We want it to be quite interactive, so please put your questions into the chat as we're going, and hopefully at the end of each session, we'll have an opportunity to address a couple of questions as well as through our discussion at the end. So this is your opportunity to hear from the experts, to ask questions and so on. This workshop actually comes off the back of a whole lot of work that's already been done, including through Responsible Investment Association Australasia's Nature Working Group, a number of efforts that RIAA members have undertaken recently on TNFD and piloting. And of course, we had a number of government-supported workshops over the past year or so as well. I will note Australia's finance community is really heavily engaged in the TNFD process. You know, we have 3 Australian task force members, including one who's joining us today. Australia is actually one of the top 4 countries that's providing feedback into the TNFD's open innovation design process for the development of this risk management and disclosure framework. So that's really wonderful to see. And we already have a really active cohort of Australian and Aotearoa companies pilot testing the draft framework already, which is really fantastic to see. But we have noted that through our engagement, including through a recent workshop that EY, Melior and Minter Ellison ran, that there is some, I guess the organisations are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. There's a bit of a knowledge gap in this space, and that there are some sectors, including the resources sector, that's a little bit more advanced. So we want to kind of help to build up that capacity and understanding. I will note as well that the TNFD is not just about reporting and disclosure. It's actually also about incorporating nature into mainstream risk management processes for enterprises and also for whole portfolios. So what we are hoping is that TNFD will become about identifying, assessing, and also responding to nature-related dependencies, impacts, and risks and opportunities. And it's really heavily aligned with other reporting frameworks, including the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the International Sustainability Standards Board's standards, which are currently under development internationally. Just a quick call out to, if you haven't already joined the consultation group list for Australia and New Zealand, RIAA is really pleased to be the convener of the official consultation group for TNFD in Australasia. Antonio, I think you're going to pop a link into the chat now, so to Antonio's email address. So please, Antonio is our fantastic working groups coordinator at RIAA, and she will help you to sign up to that link. And we also want to encourage you in that process to sign up to the TNFD forum as well, if you haven't done that already. So we'll pop a link into the chat for that as well. So yeah, do consider piloting or working with your investee companies to pilot. The idea really is to get on the journey now and then increase your disclosure ambition over time. So we know, for example, with TCFD, that the implementation of TCFD has been very iterative. That is that you start small. We know that many companies are still not reporting against the 11 or so TCFD recommendations. So those that are reporting tend to start with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, and then build that reporting ambition on disclosure over time. So I guess the key message there is don't be overwhelmed. This can start small and then get bigger. So we do hope that today's session will help to demystify what's involved in that. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Guy Williams. He's the co-chair of RIAA's Nature Working Group. He's Director of Biodiversity and Natural Capital, Sustainability and Climate Change at Deloitte, but he's also importantly really heavily involved with TNFD. He has been from the beginning as a task force member, and he's leading some of the work programs there at the global level. So he's an expert in natural capital. He spent many years in research in landscape ecology across Asia and the Pacific. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Guy. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you, everybody. Wonderful to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country and lands on which we join from today, and acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, to rivers, and to oceans. I'm really humbled to be invited by RIAA and the Australian government to deliver this TNFD briefing, but it's really our Indigenous leaders that have remained connected to nature and the best place to lead our revaluation and reconnection with nature. And the work that we are seeking to do with the TNFD task force is looking to really build that traditional knowledge into the way in which companies engage with this topic. So I wanted to make that acknowledgement. As Estelle said, I wear a number of different hats. I'm very fortunate in my various different roles, but today really talking on behalf of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. I'm one of 40, it was 36, it's now one of 40 Task Force members, and I've been involved since the beginning. So in June 2021, the Task Force kicked off with real energy and enthusiasm to try and develop a consistent and a clear management and disclosure framework for considering nature-related risks and opportunities. There was a clear calling particularly from the finance sector, that before we could actually start to address nature negative practices in finance, we needed to actually try and get some consistency in the language and the way in which companies disclose their information. So that's what we kicked off with. It's been a really busy year, probably one of the busiest years in my career. We've seen a lot of progress. And so just briefly, where we're at in that journey, as Estelle touched on, we've got a growing amount of interest globally, and particularly here in Australia. Australia and New Zealand are one of 9 consultation groups that have been established. We have now over 750 forum members, of which we all invite you all to be part of. Significant amount of interest in providing direct feedback into these beta development process. Over 500 pieces of quite detailed feedback that we've been accommodating. We've also brought on board 18 knowledge partners. So that's really important, as opposed, in addition to the perspective we get from industry, it's also making sure that we build on existing science and existing knowledge from both traditional and Western practices. This is a new topic for many of you, I'm sure, but it is not a new topic. There is a large body of information, and the task force is seeking to develop a framework and not a new standard. So although, as I've said a number of times, although we have a new acronym in the TNFD, the concepts, the definitions that lie behind it are not new. They are well trodden by many companies, and now we're just bringing it into the finance community. So just quickly, before we get into the subject of the day is how you engage in piloting, is just a little bit of a recap on where we are in the journey. As I said, the development process is market-led, and it's this open feedback process by the release of a series of beta frameworks. So we kicked off, as I said, in June 2021. In March this year, we released the first version 0.1, and that had those really core definitions around nature. What do we mean by nature? How do we accommodate climate and atmosphere into that broader definition, along with land, freshwater, and ocean systems? What do we mean by nature-related risk, and how does that align with other risk management frameworks? We also started to create the initial disclosure recommendations, and that's carried through to this day, and probably will carry through right till the end, a very intentional set of disclosure frameworks that aligns very similarly with the TCFD, making sure businesses that are already disclosing on climate are well placed to then pivot and build out to disclosing on nature. So that's really important. And obviously the release in version 0.1 of the LEAP framework, and I know that we'll hear more about that later today in terms of how that can feed into both piloting and the data and information that's needed for organizations to start to map and analyze their risks and opportunities. So the LEAP framework was released in version 0.1, but has been developed and built upon in subsequent releases, and will continue to be so. Separate to the disclosure requirements, the LEAP framework has proved to be a really useful tool for business to engage. Then in June of this year, we had version 0.2. We started to get into the meat and the real nitty-gritty around metrics and targets. And that's an ongoing process as well. And we really won't have full certainty on what those set of the targets are for organizations to track their progress around disclosure, probably until post COP15, which is the Global Biodiversity Conference, which is happening this month in Montreal. And the need to actually link progress metrics and indicators to a global target. But that's architecture and what that could look like is emerging. And obviously more specific guidance also came out. That was a huge feedback that was received by all of the organizations and industries that provided direct feedback on version 0.1, is more specific examples and more specific guidance. what does this mean for us in our sector and also for us in our particular geography or landscape? So the initial architecture around specific guidance, how that would be released, priority sectors and priority biomes or ecosystems within nature, was also released in version 0.2, and some updates to the LEAP framework to provide some specific guidance for financial institutions. So where are we at now? We're at version 0.3. You can go to the next slide, actually. So this is the most recent release. And this is really about building on the feedback that's been received. So there's some really specific documents that have been released to address specific feedback from industry stakeholders, and obviously to build towards version 0.4 and version 1, which is coming out in September of next year. So version 0.3, just briefly, as I said, it continued to bed down in the draft disclosure recommendations, the alignment with the TCFD structure in both approach and language. Really intentional and really important to build upon the work that organisations have already done in climate-related disclosure. One of the big hot topics through all of our task force meetings has been how we align with issues around materiality and double materiality versus a single or enterprise value approach. This has been an ongoing discussion for those who are involved in integrated sustainability reporting, the emergence of the ISSB, and to what extent we will look at both the impact of businesses on nature, as well as the dependency of businesses from nature in terms of how that impacts upon them. So very much an agreement now that a double materiality or a consideration or a requirement to disclose on both impacts and dependencies would be required and is an important part of businesses' re-engagement and reconnection with nature. Also, some further ongoing changes to the LEAP framework based on some of the feedback that's been received. That's really small tweaking, but the pilot testing, and we'll get onto this in a moment, some of the initial pilots that have been completed and also the ones that are underway at the moment have a lot of interest in the LEAP framework and using that as a tool to guide their engagement and piloting activities. Some specific guidance has been provided on the assess phase of the LEAP, and also some additional work in building out those metrics and targets that I spoke about previously. Some reports which have kind of come out, some discussion papers, which I really wanted to kind of let you all know about. There's a lot that comes out in these beta releases, and I understand it's a lot to digest. I can obviously take questions in the question and answer time about specific aspects of these, but the 4 pieces of the output from version 0.3 that are very important. One is around alignment with setting science-based targets for nature, and specifically some draft guidance on SBTNs that's been developed by TNFD in partnership or collaboration with the Science-Based Targets Network that is involved in that initiative. So that's really great to see the harmonisation and alignment of those 2 organisations, the TNFD and the SBTN, which will be critical through till the end of this year and kind of digesting what comes out of COP15. Also, some initial thinking around scenario analysis, also based on direct feedback that's been received, and a really great discussion paper that starts to map out who would be responsible for developing those models and scenarios, how would they be updated, and once again, how do they link to global targets. A specific case study on aquaculture has also been released, and that will be followed by other industry and environmental case studies, which are coming out in version 0.4. And then finally, and probably most importantly, is the initial discussion paper on societal dimensions of nature-related risk. This was also based on some direct feedback from stakeholders, including civil society organisations, and it covers alignment between the TNFD framework and both human rights, consent and benefit sharing, as well as the integration of traditional knowledge into the design and delivery of investments in nature. So I think for all of you, and particularly all of us here in Australia and New Zealand, I think that's a really important piece and something that we'd like to just highlight as something that you may want to carry through to your piloting activities, should you decide to progress those. Next slide, please. This is just the final one on the update. This is kind of where we're at in the journey. Everything is building upon the previous release. And so it's really a very vast kind of resource and set of information that's being prepared. All of that is being taken from these discussion papers into an online portal. So I encourage you to jump onto the TNFD website, and you should find it relatively easy to navigate your way through the relevant parts, through an interactive kind of table of contents. That's going to become even more so with subsequent releases, more interactive and accessible to avoid the need for people having to digest multiple PDFs. So the understanding being a more of a user journey where, depending on your sector, depending on your region, depending on the nature of your organization and the relationship that you have with your assets, you'll be able to then be pointed or directed to specific guidance of relevance to you without having to wade your way through technical guidance to find a section that may or may not be relevant to you. So that's something we, based on feedback, because this is new, there's a lot of information coming out, is how do we best navigate and orientate new users and new engagers with the information that's coming out. So this is a bit of just a sneak peek on what we're working on at the moment. Further modifications to the disclosure recommendations, the architecture and structure of those will follow and align with what we've seen in the TCFD. So governance, strategy, risk management, and then the need for articulation around metrics and targets. But the actual detail behind them will continue to be tweaked and edited based on feedback through to version 1.0. The proposed approach to disclosure metrics, so moving on from the specific impact metrics into disclosure metrics, and some more detailed guidance around scenarios will also be released. And also the work that I'm leading on in one of the working groups is the work on guidance. So that's a series of sector-based guidances which are being developed, as well as I mentioned, those biome or eco-region or eco-type guidance. And so at the moment, we know the priority and the focus, in addition to finance sector guidance, is also including agriculture, food and forestry, energy, including both renewable and non-renewable, and mining and extractives. But there's also plans in play with the adoption of some new task force members to also look at chemicals, consumer goods, and the built environment, which includes both property and infrastructure. So happy to take questions on that later and relevant for you in terms of where you and your investments or your activities might fit within those priority sectors. But version 0.4 is going to be a really big one for guidance. So that's kind of the process so far. Next slide. So now onto the real subject of the day. And as I said, please kind of drop your questions into the chat or hold them for afterwards, because we're covering a fair bit of information here. But just really quickly, before we talk about how you can engage in piloting or the various different ways that you can do it, really important to consider why the TNFD is asking organisations to consider digging deeper and diving deeper into the framework. So from the task force perspective, of course, they're looking for as much feedback as possible. This is market-led, and they want it to be market accepted when it is released with version 1.0. So that need for both market leadership and science base also is guiding the type of pilots that they're asking for, and the open innovation approach actually requires, it's essential in the design of that approach, that various different stages, the draft can be taken by organisations and really thrashed about and beaten up and seen how it works or it doesn't work. And that feedback, there's a responsibility on the task force and the Secretariat in particular, to address and to respond to that feedback that comes through. It also allows a broadening of the engagement with different stakeholders by you engaging in your own pilots with your own community, within your own ecosystem of actors. You're also broadening the uptake and the understanding around what the TNFD is. Exposure to frameworks and approaches like the LEAP framework helps to build that level of understanding and awareness of the TNFD within the broader market. And it's also, as I mentioned, the ability to engage with other non-market participants that are really critical to this. And we've mentioned in there, First Nations groups, scientists and regulators. In some cases, they may very much be market participants. You maybe have regulators or Indigenous enterprises that are really leading market initiatives. But in some cases, it may not be. So they may be actually quite separate or distanced from a process to develop a finance framework. So the pilots enable and encourage that type of broader engagement with non-market actors. And obviously for all of you, or for those organisations that are taking up pilots, a huge opportunity to test the framework and to inform and to shape it, to put your stamp on it, to make sure that you're comfortable and familiar with what comes out in version 1.0 is something that could work for your organisation, or at least if the disclosure requests come through your value chain or through your investment chain, you know the kind of language that's being used. So that kind of readiness, which we'll touch on in a moment, is also really key for that engagement in the piloting process. So just briefly, this diagram on the right is kind of a relatively busy one, but it just shows the various different ways that the TNFD is building ongoing stakeholder consultation into the development of the framework. As I mentioned before, we have these knowledge and implementation partners, which are quite diverse. You know, we have the likes of WWF, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, as well as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So we have both business and ecological institutions and organizations represented there. And that's also where the piloting partners sit. A number of the industry piloting activities is coordinated by partner groups who take particular sectors and make sure there's some alignment and consistency. We then have obviously the task force itself, which kind of sits with all those arrows facing at it. And that's the wonderful pressure that we love and feel as task force members. So we take all the feedback coming through from knowledge partners, from the Secretariat and from broader stakeholders into the actual development of the framework itself. And then we have this broader stakeholder process, which includes these consultation groups, which includes this very workshop today, but is also including that market feedback through piloting. Just to clarify finally as well, is that the 1st of June of next year is when the deadline is for submitting final piloting. So where you might have actually undertaken a pilot and you wish to actually write it up to provide direct feedback. But there is ongoing consultation on the framework itself right through until September 2023. And as Estelle mentioned, this is a fast-moving process, but it's also just a first step in the process. So there will be opportunities to feedback and to input into, and to also revise the framework itself post version 1.0 release. But that kind of key deadline of between now and 1st of June 2023 will really shape how you would like to get involved in the process. Next slide. I'll cover this one really quickly. So this is kind of like the what. This is what the task force is seeking in piloting. They want a really broad and diverse mix of pilots. I've said this on a number of times. It's probably the last thing that the task force needs is another European-based financial institution or commercial bank suggesting that it wants to pilot. I'm sure it would welcome the feedback, but it definitely has those covered in spades. So now it's really looking at diversity of sector and diversity of geography. So for us here in Australia and New Zealand, it's fantastic. It's a great opportunity for us to give our perspective from those sectors that we're involved in, that we'll discuss later, are really key and material to delivering on financial disclosure. And that's really all sectors. So everything from telco through to consumer goods, from energy through to extractives. So that's really important. So far, over 200 organizations are starting to design and ready piloting activities. So that's huge. And it's particularly the role of a chap called Felipe from the Secretariat with his team that's coordinating those to make sure where possible, all that information can progressively come through. So information from 46 pilots actually was used in the development of version 0.3, particularly around the LEAP process, and that assess, or the A within the LEAP framework, is where most of the feedback came through on piloting. We're seeing increasingly more organizations looking at the L, or the locate phase of the LEAP framework. Is, for example, we know as an institution it's really difficult for us to map all of our different investments and assets because there's so many and so complex. So what kind of information would we need, or would we need to ask of those actors within our value chain to start to map and to locate those impacts and dependencies? The results of 2 full TNFD pilots have been disclosed, and I encourage you to go onto the web. You can Google TNFD and Kirin or TNFD and AXA. Both have released really fantastic reports with, in the case of Kirin, an English translation infographic to kind of show what came out of their piloting activities. And again, both of those, Kirin was largely focused on piloting the LEAP framework. AXA, a little bit more on kind of organizational readiness, a slightly different approach to piloting, which I'll touch on in a second. This is a summary table on the right, just to give you a bit of an idea of where we're seeing those pilots come through. So, you know, we're seeing a really broad mix, and you can see all sectors now largely covered globally. The darker green is where we're seeing most of the piloting activities. So particularly agriculture, food and beverage, as you would expect. Agriculture, because probably that's where the rubber's going to hit the road for a lot of these high impact sectors. Food and beverage, because they have very complex supply chains, and for them to be able to extract that data, a little bit like some financial institutions, is very challenging. And obviously financial institutions themselves are engaging in this very heavily. I invite you all to throw your eyes at those white space around the Australia and New Zealand, where we don't currently have pilots that have been put forward to the Secretariat. So if these relate to businesses, I know energy, mining and metals mentioned there, fisheries and aquaculture, huge parts of the Australian economy, and will be part of our play around TNFD. So there may be pilots being developed, but this is just based on what's been received by the Secretariat and what they're currently planning to accommodate into version 0.4 updates. Next slide. And I think maybe my last one. So this is really took me like the biggest drum roll ever to get to this one. So this is kind of the how. This is for all of you ways that you may look to engage in piloting activities. And so the principles that have been established is how you can, it's a bit of a choose your own adventure. So if you want to go really broad across your organization or portfolio, or you want to go really narrow and specific around one particular asset, one particular investment project, both of those are very valid approaches, you know, that broad versus deep, or a combination of both. But these principles are really important, making sure that you allow for diverse feedback, that it's not just one stakeholder within your organization that's running the pilot and providing all of that feedback on their experience. So we want to see different people within the organization and also within your stakeholder group. You know, how could they provide data? How could they feed into this? Transparency is really important. So providing both positive and negative experiences on engaging with the framework. The Secretariat has very thick skin, and we love to get really critical, juicy feedback. So if something doesn't make sense, doesn't work for you, that's the kind of feedback we want to come through piloting. Obviously peer exchange. So exactly, we've got Sally and Laura from Pollination and Blackmores with us today. So that kind of peer exchange around attending webinars, sharing your experience, using the consultation groups is really important. And obviously making sure that you are mindful around the resources that's needed to deliver a pilot. So you will probably need support. You will maybe need to bring support in by engaging directly with the Secretariat, or engaging with some of your knowledge partners or your technical partners, consultants or others. So that level of support is needed to make sure that the pilot is delivered effectively and that feedback is collected so it can be useful. So now in terms of the different approaches to piloting, this is also being kind of reframed around the different scopes around how you can engage in the TNFD framework itself. And there's something Estelle mentioned. We don't expect organizations to be doing full disclosure across all aspects of their business from day one. And in a similar way, organizations are being encouraged to choose where it's going to be most meaningful, impactful and manageable for them to focus the scope of their pilots. So here we've mentioned in this spectrum here, you can see the types of pilots. As you have those varying from those that are more complex to less complex. So from a lower complex type of pilot, we call these like a readiness assessment. How ready or prepared is your organization to be able to disclose on nature-related risks? How well established is your existing governance structure, your existing strategy around nature? And to what extent can you build out off your work you've been doing on climate and TCFD? So some level of gap analysis around how ready or prepared your organization is really useful feedback, and is a way that we're seeing many organizations engage in the piloting process. Then at the complete other end of the spectrum is actually, as I was mentioning, is taking the LEAP framework to try and actually locate or evaluate or assess those nature-related impacts and dependencies in your business. So that could be done either at a portfolio level or a whole of organization level, or it could be done on a specific project, either where you have good relationships with stakeholders, where you know you can get access to the data more easily at a higher resolution or deeper level, or the opposite, where you've really been bothered or worried about the ability to communicate and report on a particular investment because of some perceived nature-related impacts or risks. So that could be one where you actually start to say, well, how deep can we go? What information do we have? to consider and assess nature-related risks versus what data and information do we need to get and where do we get that information from. So that more higher, complex or deep, more specific, detailed assessment is really important. And then there's a bit of a combination of the both. So one that kind of looks at organizational readiness, but I might look at across, a high-level heat mapping or a risk exposure across your portfolio. What are those big sectors or industries or regions that you're currently investing in that may present particular material risks that need to be considered more deeply by your TNFD disclosure? So that's kind of the third option. So we see those three options, and we can discuss those in Q&A in a moment. And I think also another really important part of piloting is seeing to what extent existing initiatives and data that your organization already has that you didn't even realize was useful and relevant to feeding into your disclosure on nature. And we see many organizations seeing nature as a next issue or a next agenda around sustainable finance and investment, that they may be progressing some level of maturity on issues like human rights or on climate, and now they're moving or pivoting onto nature. And we really discourage that kind of viewpoint, understanding that nature is far more inclusive than just the next sustainability issue on the list. That climate and the progress of the work that your organization has already done on climate is critical to building out your work on nature. So all the data, all the systems, all the governance, all of the strategy that you've developed around climate and net zero is very relevant for building into your piloting activities. And similarly around the social consideration, as we've mentioned, Estelle and I already, the Indigenous knowledge that is actually built into your value chain. How do you bring that into identifying, to reconnecting and revaluing with nature? And obviously we see a number of organizations who have done extensive mapping of their supply chains for issues such as modern slavery. That's great for that locate phase. How well do you know your value chain and your business? And how well can you engage with your suppliers to be able to pull that data out that you might need for the subsequent steps in the LEAP framework? Making sure that you do bring all of that on this, but it's, as I mentioned, it's a fantastic process where organizations can choose how shallow or deep they want to take the piloting activities. Next slide. So I'm going to pause there. As I said, that's a lot of information. Maybe I might hand back to you, Estelle, if you want to facilitate any questions that might come through before we hand on.
Sure. Look, does anybody have, thanks very much, Guy, that was really illuminating. Does anybody have any questions for Guy? Please feel free to pop them in the chat. You can come off mute if you're game. We will have an opportunity to have a further discussion later on. So if nobody has any questions at this point, we might move straight on to the second part of our session, which is a deep dive into the Blackmores piloting of TNFD. We're really fortunate to have with us the two people who were heavily involved in that. So thank you so much for joining us, Sally Townsend. She is the head of sustainability at Blackmores Group. She has 20 years of experience in sustainability and corporate strategy, and she's currently has responsibility for the Blackmores Group sustainability vision, integrating this into the core business strategy of Blackmores. And she's been working on TNFD piloting with Laura Waterford, who is a director at Pollination. Her work focuses on nature-positive corporate strategy and policy and opportunities in the natural capital and nature-based solutions space. She has previous experience as a climate and environmental lawyer. So I'll hand over to you, Sally and Laura.
Thanks so much, Estelle. And for those of you who are familiar with Blackmores, this is actually Blackmores' 90th year of being in business. And if you've followed us for a while, you'd know that sustainability actually is something that's always been really central to our values. And Maurice Blackmore knew back in the 1930s that you can't have healthy people without a healthy planet. But it's only recently that we've actually had the chance to sort of re-reflect on things that Maurice wrote back in the 1930s on soil quality and human health and the connection between the two years ago, which suddenly still sort of seem very relevant when we're looking at things like soil carbon capture and addressing the importance of soil and nutrients for addressing biodiversity risk. And I think it probably is the thing about Blackmores is our values and our purpose might be nearly 90 years old, but perhaps given some of the challenges that we're faced with today, they're more relevant than ever before. So we're looking at a supply chain that's got more than 1,000 ingredients. And when it comes to nature risk assessments, we've done one risk assessment of those 1,000, we're one down. But we are dealing with a very global supply chain. We source our ingredients from across 36 different countries, and we work with 172 suppliers in doing that. And over the last 4 years, we've really expanded this responsible sourcing work with much deeper accountability for the goals that we've set. So for example, this year we committed to a sustainability linked loan where we tethered half of our group debt facilities to achievement of ambitious targets towards net zero by 2030 and progress towards an ethical supply chain. Next slide, please, to show you this. This was actually this Graham Mackay cartoon we saw in the very early days of the pandemic. And across our organisation, this was really the catalyst, because this was a timely and very frightening reminder that, when you're looking at the metaphorical tsunami that was the pandemic and its health and its economic impacts, that they would really pale in comparison to the effects of climate change and also the collapse of diverse ecosystems in our natural environment. And at Blackmores, we know that that twin challenge of climate change and biodiversity loss are before all else a health crisis, and that really compelled us to act. So next slide, coinciding with the TNFD's publication of the first framework, we partnered with Pollination to help us build a scalable approach to understanding nature risks and dependencies. And we really wanted to be able to be in a position to identify the first steps to making a nature positive commitment. So you'll see from that first stage, that was something we could really easily do on our own. That was about using what Guy was talking about, the insights from our Climate Resilience Action Plan. And we were lucky we had a scientific literature review that Blackmores Institute had published on the impacts that climate change would have on access to natural medicine. And we used our human rights supply risk assessment framework so that we were able to shortlist what we believed were our most vulnerable ingredients. And the next stage was more co-creation with Pollination. We started to add in the commercial and operational dependencies, and Pollination considered what would be the external data sets that would be available to us. And this resulted in the development of a supplier questionnaire. So then in the third stage, we did produce those very detailed value chain maps. And very importantly, we started developing education and information tools so that we could bring suppliers on the journey. One thing we're very conscious of is that nature risks and dependencies aren't well understood, and stakeholder engagement throughout this process through a number of mediums. We've done webinars, we've developed video content, and we've hosted one-on-one knowledge exchanges, has been fundamentally important to be able to deliver the pilot. Then the team from Pollination took over, because we actually couldn't have done this piece of work without them. They really showcased their expertise at this point. They layered in data and they identified numerous different scenarios, and they developed for us a really extensive register of both risks and opportunities. Their report just on one ingredient was about 50 pages long of data and insights. But what it did, it gave us a great opportunity to collaborate and come back together and distill those insights into actions. And for us, that included applying our financial sensitivity model, which enabled us to develop or to sort of understand the impacts that various nature risk scenarios could have on our future revenues. So I'm just going to pass the baton to Laura now to talk through the work they did on the pilot in more detail.
Thanks, Ali. I'll speak to some of the results for one element of the value chain in a moment, but before I get to that, I just wanted to touch on sort of the, to the next slide, please. That was perfect. I just wanted to touch on sort of the underlying thinking about how we've been approaching applying the LEAP framework. And I think what's enabled us to make that tractable is deceptively simple. So obviously we need to think through dependencies and impacts and transition and physical risks. The LEAP framework tells us that, but we've sort of identified that there is a pretty clear link between dependencies and physical risk and impacts and transition risk. And so that's sort of the key to our analysis and how it's structured. And the significance of that is that if we think through from the very first stage of identifying key impacts and dependencies issues, then we can pull that through to physical and transition risk and ultimately what the commercial implications and opportunities are for a business. So from a dependencies perspective, like many organisations, Blackmores and its suppliers are really dependent on nature and ecosystem services for the business activities all across their supply chain. And that was true of this ingredient. And it's a question of, in the dependencies discussion, what ecosystem services specifically at the locations in which your operations take place are really important or material to the continued ability to carry out those activities. So that's the question we ask. What are the relevant ecosystem services? First of all, to understand what the key dependencies might be that need further consideration. And then to Sally's point about thinking through what that means from a risk perspective. We know we don't have scenarios yet for biodiversity in the way that we do for climate, but we did think in terms of a high physical risk lens. So if the natural capital assets and ecosystems in the relevant location for each stage of the value chain degraded heavily over time, what would that mean if you pulled that all the way through to understanding the commercial implications? Then on the flip side, from an impacts perspective, I guess this is a little bit more varied, but at each stage in the value chain, activities that are undertaken have an impact on nature. And so for this one, rather than thinking about ecosystem services, the question is, what are the impact drivers that those activities are contributing to? And that is the drivers of nature loss and biodiversity loss. So in answering that question for each stage of the value chain, that then enables us to think about what some of the transition risks are that might be associated with those impacts. It's things like changing consumer preferences or increased regulation to try to sort of manage the severity of those impacts in a given location. And so that piece of analysis is also reasonably geographically specific because it depends on the regulatory environment, for example, and the sort of existing consumer preferences in a given location. The last thing I'll call out on this slide is that there is obviously a feedback loop between impacts and dependencies. So where an organisation has an impact on nature in a given location, that can exacerbate the degradation of nature and enhance, therefore, the risks around dependencies and physical risk. But for the purposes of this sort of high-level approach, we tend to treat those separately, but just call out where we think that interdependency between impacts and risks is really important. Jumping to the next slide. This is a high-level overview of the results for one stage of the pilot in the Blackmores value chain. This was the farming stage, so effectively very similar risk profile to any organisation that is either in the agriculture sector or has a supply chain that is based in the agriculture sector. And you'll see we've called out in the top right quadrant there what we assessed as the material risks for this element of the supply chain, both the physical and transition risks. So the physical risks are in dark blue and the transition risks are in a teal colour there. So at the sort of farming stage of this part of the supply chain, it's a crop-based ingredient that we've done the analysis on. So it's a question of, from a transition risk and impacts perspective, things like land use management. So how is the crop grown? And what sort of inputs are required? So water pollution, for example, is a transition risk issue based on whether or not there is runoff of things like herbicides, pesticides and fertilizers associated with the cropping practices. The physical risk side of the equation is a question of what sort of support does healthy nature provide at that element of the supply chain. So, for example, erosion control, flood and storm protection are things that healthy vegetation provide. Soil quality is obviously really important for growing healthy crops. Climate stabilization is pretty much what we all know and love as climate risk from a physical risk perspective. And then there's also the question of the water cycle. So having regular rainfall is also really important for this crop. Turning that into a question of what do the risks actually look like, moving beyond just the dependencies, it's a question of whether or not there could be further degradation of the soil, meaning that sort of there's a loss of arable land in the supply chain, questions about whether or not water would become more scarce, or there could be more severe floods because the natural vegetation isn't there to help attenuate the severity of those types of events. And then on the transition risk side, it's a question of whether or not, for example, regulation could change to try to encourage more sustainable or regenerative farming practices to the extent that this might be a monoculture crop, for example, that's sort of grown through traditional tilling practices and through the use of, fertilizer, herbicides and pesticides that I mentioned before. So that's, I guess, a whip around of the types of risks that we've identified from a transition and physical risk perspective. But then there's also a question when we think through how to apply the LEAP framework around what are the opportunities for a business once you know the ways in which the business interacts with nature at a given part of the supply chain. And I think that's been, and Sally will speak to this more, but I think that's been a really interesting part of the exercise. So thinking through, for example, what are the synergies between risk mitigation opportunities in the supply chain and opportunities for new value creation? And I think a big one for the farming element of the supply chain, which probably won't come as a huge surprise, is around regenerative agricultural practices. So to the extent that you change the way farmers are growing this crop, is there an opportunity then to participate, for example, in carbon markets or potentially even biodiversity credit markets? And flowing from that, are there opportunities to think about how this product is ultimately marketed, for example, as a regenerative product? Is the sort of high level thinking, I guess, we've done around what the opportunities are. I just sort of close, I think, on this slide by saying that we did follow at a high level the LEAP framework in the way that we did this. We've done quite a close study of which precise dot points under each element of the LEAP framework we've been able to apply, and we did pretty well. I guess we've used reasonably high level data sets, but we have been able to work our way through most elements of the framework. Sally, I'll hand back to you for the next slide in terms of the business perspective.
Yeah, no, thanks, Laura. And, from our perspective, some of the things that we learned specifically that were illuminated to us were very much around this climate-nature nexus. So we know that investing in nature is probably going to be one of our great carbon abatement accelerators. And we did heavily use our climate stability, understanding the physical risks and transition impacts as critical inputs that went into the pilot. But one thing that was really obvious to us is the approach to assessing climate risk is very different to assessing nature risk. We couldn't have actually completed the pilot without the engagement of the supplier. We can't do this work on their behalf because we're requiring very specific data points and knowledge from them about their practices and their location. But we've been very mindful to make sure that in doing this, that we're looking for how the findings can add value back to their operations and that this isn't seen as just being another impost that we're putting on them. Because keep in mind that for many businesses, supplier relationships previously were just limited to commercial drivers and for us also quality. But in the last 4 years, we've been asking for a lot more information to assess human rights, labour relations. We've started mapping our Scope 3 emissions, and we needed to make sure that we're bringing suppliers on this journey so that we can transform our ways of working together that's inclusive of all of those important elements. Because we do have a complex and global supply chain, it was very helpful for us to receive that validation that the farming stage is where our focus needs to be. And as Laura said, we found, we knew we went into it being able to identify areas of risk, but we were really pleased to see that there were some clear opportunities for us. So all up, this was about a 4-month labour of love between Blackmores and Pollination in partnership to do this one nature risk assessment. And those findings aside, as well as some of the specific risks that Laura spoke about earlier, just reflecting on that, we have to think, what did we really learn from this? And just for my final slide, was about how this actually reframes up our approach. So next slide, please. Guy mentioned it earlier, but probably one of the biggest obstacles to overcome is the need to build capability. This needs to be understood far more broadly across our sector, but we also know it's a very specific skill set. For example, ecological expertise just doesn't exist within the Australian business community. It isn't feasible for us to replicate this pilot another 900 times for every ingredient that we use in our products. So the next step for us will be the development of a strategic materiality assessment so we can be very intentional about how we prioritise and resource this program of work. We know that access to data and our need to set meaningful targets and metrics is going to still be a challenge, but we know that it'll be important to make sure that we deliver the right outcomes. And probably one of the biggest enablers to address that challenge is going to be by collaborating further with the scientific and academic community and by working with governments to aggregate more data and make sure that that's available for us to use while we're developing and nurturing those skills, and making sure that once we've got the data, we can find meaning in that and that we can unlock the insights that will result in actions that will deliver change. But I think sort of going into this pilot, one single ingredient from one location, we went into it to think, how do we take this insurmountable challenge and, you know, effectively make it easy to eat the elephant one bite at a time? But what we really learned is that nature loss isn't a complicated problem, it's a complex problem. And I think we've been using those two terms interchangeably, but one thing we learned from doing this is they're vastly different. So a complicated problem for us is our scope 3 measurement, where we've just got to break it down into small pieces and series of tasks and simplify them and build those into our business. But nature is incredibly complex. So simplification sort of seems to be the wrong mindset to take. We need to find systems and ways of embedding this that reflect the fact that nature is nuanced, that there's going to be a lot of information here that's unknown, and there's so many interrelated factors that we want to make sure that we're not applying a simple rule to solve a complex problem. And having that knowledge really gave us the confidence to know that we can't jump into setting a metric yet. We've got a little bit more to learn. And hopefully the investment community looking for ways to rate and consider companies' performance in this area as we move forward takes into account that complexity, knowing that it isn't going to be like emissions where we've got a number that's, you know, universal across all of us that we just measure and report. So we're working to build adaptive and systems-based approach to how we tackle nature risk, and very importantly to make sure that we're informed by a diversity of skill sets as we do it. But we're pretty committed to continuing to make progress, not just because of the protection of nature, but also because of the impacts on people and communities. We do have a vision for a world where people and nature thrive together. And I think this is an important part of delivering on that vision. So thanks, Estelle, for the opportunity to learn from everyone today.
Great, thanks so much, Sally. That's really helpful. You know, coming off Guy's excellent presentation about the different kinds of ways to pilot. I might just ask a couple of quick questions now, if you don't mind, before we move on. You did mention that this process took you 4 months and that you were working with Laura at Pollination. Can you just let us know, because we often hear this feedback about the lack of resources, which you touched on. Could you just talk about who else was involved, like how many people were involved? Like, just bring it to life for us a little bit. And Guy, I might ask you after that just to talk about where you see the skills gaps and who else, you know, in the industries kind of need to be skilled up on this. But to you first, Sally.
Yeah, so as far as people involved across our business, our strategic sourcing and procurement team was obviously very important. Some of the insights, we worked with Blackmores Institute on natural impacts. So that was more of a scientific basis. But really strategic sourcing and the people that have the relationship with the supplier were most critical. Then obviously the supplier themselves in being able to provide the data. And I think the reason it took time was developing the right data set, going back to the supplier and giving them time to get that information. These are questions that they haven't been asked before, and we need to give them a time to uplift their capability as well. And then once Pollination went back and, you know, worked their magic at their end to develop the sort of ecological insights for it, it comes back in, and when we're looking at testing it through our financial model, then we get, again, lots of cross-functional teams involved, whether that's our finance team working out different cost impacts through the manufacturing stage, talking through commercial outcomes with our sales team and marketing team. All of these different things help us get a balanced view for understanding what are all the different variables that could be impacted by the scenario so that we can determine what the consequence could potentially be on our future revenues.
That's great. Thanks, Sally. Guy, I might just ask you to talk a little bit about who else in our community needs to get more engaged with TNFD and what are the skills that are required here? Yeah,
and I didn't plan this, but I think at this very time, there's a separate workshop being run around nature and the TNFD by the Chartered Accountants Institute of Australia. And I think that's a key one is what Sally and Laura have mentioned is that, you know, businesses are seeking to rapidly reconnect and to revalue the importance of nature. They know intrinsically that's important, that it sits as a foundation, but how do you actually bring that into business decision making? So that doesn't, apologies, Jay, I'm also an ecologist, so I can say this, it doesn't need more ecologists. Ecologists have a critical role to play, and there's actually a lot of those out there that'll be part of this journey. But what it really does need is it needs people who talk business language, those from accounting disciplines, those from financial management, those who can actually make decisions using a cost-benefit analysis around where an organisation prioritises, to also understand the complexity that Sally was referring to. So in terms of the skills gap, we would love to see in 5 years, or hopefully less, a cohort of new accountants coming through graduate degrees who have accounting for nature as part of their kind of core skill base. We would love to see, financial managers and financial advisors who can make decisions on the long-term benefits of investing in nature, as opposed to just the short-term benefit of extracting resources from depressed ecosystems. So ecologists are important, but there is a little bit of a rush to go and build in a team of technical ecologists. But if you need data from the field, that's great. Ecology has that role to play. But if you need to actually make sense upwards in your organisation or outwards in your supply chain, then you may actually look to build those capabilities in different disciplines.
Great, thanks, Guy. That's really helpful. I might ask you as well, Guy, just quickly, you outlined the different ways to pilot before. Which category do you think that this Blackmores pilot fits into?
That's why we were so excited to get Sally and Laura presenting, because what they've done in the true style of piloting, in the true fashion, is taken a slightly more integrated approach. It made sense for them to do a level of organisational readiness, and to what extent their existing, as Sally and Laura both mentioned, existing data strategy governance was relevant and relevant and ready for the TNFD. But they also have done deep dives. They've looked at particular commodities, and they've looked at the complexity of their supply chain. So and that's why it's wonderful. I think you could probably tick elements of all three of those three options I presented in the Blackmores pilot, and that's what we encourage. We encourage those different approaches, to go broad across your organisation or your portfolio, and then to choose where you might want to go deep to look at issues around data readiness, around supplier readiness, to provide that information.
Fantastic, thanks, Guy. And there's one question in the chat just before we move on, which is around from Isabel. Beyond the use of the LEAP framework and the data received or commissioned from the Science Institute, what risk materiality impact dependency tools, if any, did Blackmores use? And perhaps go through some key takeaways from the use of those, whether they're positive or negative. Thanks, Sally.
Yeah, we're very much in our early days, but as far as things go, the intention was that this was looked at as risk in its own right, but then incorporated into our enterprise risk framework. As far as how, but it is early days for us for integration, but that's end game for us. This is something that needs to be embedded right throughout our different business systems, as opposed to something that sits separately. But this is really the beginning of the journey for us.
I could add to that, Sally, in terms of some of the specific data sets that we used for different elements of applying the LEAP framework for this case study. Different data sets for different stages, I guess. So, for example, in terms of locating, that sort of information came from the supplier as to where we needed to be looking specifically for the farming stage. But then to sort of understand the state or the type of nature and what the ecosystems were in that location, we used a tool called One Earth, which helps you identify relevant ecoregions. And then in terms of identifying what the relevant or material impacts and dependencies type issues were, so the impact drivers and the ecosystem services that were most relevant, that's where we used Encore, which is a publicly available tool. But then after we sort of got those initial insights from Encore, there was quite a bit of work to make it real for the business and to actually understand, based on the supplier data that was provided and the insights that Blackmores was able to provide, what that materiality rating really should be for this specific ingredient in this specific location based on Blackmores' specific activities in that location. So, there are some high-level data sets that you can absolutely use to give you a jumping off point for thinking through the full piece of analysis. But I think to make it most useful for the client, we did quite a bit of bespoke work in thinking through exactly where the risks did sit.
That's great. Thanks very much, Laura. So we'll move on now to Jay Hender, who is the head of natural capital at Climate Friendly. He's going to talk with us about try to sort of demystify, getting to the bottom of some of the science on this. Jay heads up Climate Friendly's work on natural capital and structuring ways to incentivise land management practices that provide ecosystem benefits. He's got a very strong background in government policy as well as private environmental consultancy services. So thanks very much. Over to you, Jay.
Thanks. And I'll note that whilst I'm working for Climate Friendly, I will draw on that historical knowledge that I've picked up. So I did work on the Samuel's review of the country's environment laws before this, but have worked in a range of other private and public environmental roles. So whilst I'm working for a traditional carbon company, that's not all of the knowledge that I'm bringing in this discussion. Today I'll quickly outline who is Climate Friendly. I'll try and outline the link between carbon services and nature services, so people can understand why TCFD and TNFD are trying to develop aligned frameworks, and I'll outline a little bit on how I think the TNFD might in practice roll out within Australia, noting that it's still a draft framework. It's trying to read between the lines on how some of the different elements that exist in Australia might interact with that framework. And I'll provide a few case studies on things that that we've been working on with partners to deliver that we think might be of use under the framework. Next slide. So who is Climate Friendly? As I've noted, we're a carbon services provider. The best way to think of what we do is we work with landholders to change the way that they manage their land to store carbon. We generally rely on more technology than many people would realise, and I'll outline a little bit of detail on how that might help monitoring nature a little bit later on. And we partner with traditional custodians as well across multiple projects. So we've got a reasonable experience of consulting with traditional owners in developing these projects. Next slide. At a very high level, I like to think of carbon, nature, and particularly agricultural production as a Venn diagram. In storing carbon in nature, whether it be in soils or trees or avoiding clearing, in most cases, it improves some elements of nature, whether that be improving habitat, biodiversity, and water quality would be examples. I note that there are exceptions to this, so this is not a blanket rule, but in many cases, storing carbon in the landscape improves nature, and it can be done in ways where you can actually improve your agricultural production or minimise your inputs. So there's a way you can improve nature, store carbon, and improve your agricultural production at the same time. And understanding this is important, as it does mean that improving nature doesn't have to be an impost necessarily on suppliers. It can actually be done in ways that's profitable. Next slide. Just quickly, in terms of where projects exist, these are just the climate friendly ones. I will note that there is a large number of other carbon service providers, but in total, it's probably bordering on 10% of Australia's landmass is now under carbon management, which is very unique internationally. There is a large area of our continent where nature is being impacted one way or another through altering management of that land. So it does put Australia in a relatively unique position in that we, in essence, have nature outcomes being delivered through carbon services, and that may prove helpful under the TNFD framework as people try and see how they can alter their nature impact. Next slide. Just in terms of how nature can be improved, you can reduce erosion, improve soils, provide shelter for stock, improve biodiversity, and restore degraded land. So these are all what we would call co-benefits that come out of changing land management to deliver carbon storage in the landscape. So these things have generally not been valued highly within carbon projects in the past, but increasingly there is a focus on making sure that if you're improving your land management, you're delivering these other services that will improve nature. Next slide. This is the LEAP framework copied and pasted from the TNFD documents, and I've tried to overlay what I think practically companies and providers will end up doing in those relevant parts of the LEAP framework. So if I work from left to right, there's been plenty of discussion from Laura, Guy and Sally on needing to locate where impacts occur, whether it be on your own land or through your supply chain. And I wouldn't underestimate the challenge of navigating supply chains, but as Sally and Laura have shown, it can be done. And that can be navigating back to an individual piece of land or a region. It doesn't have to be one or the other. In the middle, the E and the A, the evaluate and assess elements of LEAP, I expect will likely form what people will refer to as natural capital reports that are aligned potentially with TNFD. Others may have a different view on how this may roll out, but I see that central element of measuring your metrics, indicators and targets occurring in that area. And I'll explain that there's quite a bit of work being done on delivering these kind of products. You would need to engage with relevant people, be traditional owners. I would note that we've got a number of environmental NGOs on this call, and they are a group that is particularly skilled in improving nature. So in terms of groups you may want to engage with, it's so the scientific community and the NGO community, I think are ones to really spend time investing in. As you move to the right, the prepare, I really see there as being three high-level options. If the aim is to improve nature, really you need to manage your own land in a different way that improves nature. You can indirectly influence your supply chain through who you procure from or incentivizing the way with which they interact and manage nature, or you can procure nature improvements from a third party. There may be other options, but they're the main ones that I can see, and there's certainly been a lot of work to deliver services related to those three things already. Next slide. Just a little bit on demystifying how I think some of the target elements may roll out within Australia. I would note that Australia does have some national environment laws, which I would certainly think many people would agree are lacking. However, the government is currently reviewing and responding to a review on those laws. However, even within those laws, there is quite clear guidance on particular species and ecological communities of concern, with some guidance through conservation notes and recovery plans as to how you might want to improve those particular areas of concern. So Australia is in a reasonably good position in that space. Our state governments also have a range of regulatory frameworks with for matters such as water quality that can be relied on. Whilst it's always improving, and I would say that we certainly don't know as much about nature as we would like, we do have a reasonable level of environmental data compared to a lot of other countries, and it is rapidly improving. So I've just given a list of some of the publicly available resources if people wanted to have a look at what kind of environmental data is available at a national scale, and there's much more coming in the not too distant future. Next slide. So how do you measure nature impacts, particularly within Australia? This is drawing on the natural capital reports that I noted that I think will form a key element of the LEAP steps. There's really 3 levels of reports, and they have different purposes. At the first level, you have a satellite-based click button report that tells you at a high level what's the impact or state of nature in a particular region. And I've just put SIBO Labs as an example of a company that works in that kind of space. I would note there are plenty of other companies and people working in this area, but I'm just giving some examples. There's a second level where once you have a satellite-based report, the land manager then provides input on fertilizer use, land management, and other things that they're doing on their land. And some brilliant work has been occurring through what's called Farming for the Future, where they're trialing better tools to do this across 100 landholders, funded through, I believe, philanthropic and government resources. But that's an area to look at, and that's rapidly improving. And then last is where you need to procure nature improvements. There's carbon regulation, but increasingly accounting for nature is becoming a de facto standard that people can look at for verifying nature improvements. Next slide. This is just an example of a satellite-based natural capital analysis. This is just on one of the properties we've been looking at, and we're certainly working to build an automated natural capital report for early next year, where you put in a land parcel, you press a button, and you get a range of useful metrics on that particular bit of land that relate to the TNFD framework. Others are working on similar things. So it's really just a note that the supply chain analysis is difficult now. The assessing nature element is rapidly evolving, and there'll be products available by the time the TNFD framework is finalised. Next slide. I'll just outline how you can integrate carbon and nature. So next slide. Apologies. We've been working in partnership with Bush Heritage Australia on what I think is a quite innovative approach to monitor bioconditions. So think of biodiversity across large properties. So this may be relevant for anyone that's managing large parcels of land, whether it be for agriculture or mining or other purposes. Next slide. The approach aims to align the monitoring of carbon with the monitoring of vegetation condition. And for the ecologists there, you'd be well aware that it's not a simple thing to monitor health of nature across very large properties traditionally. The emergence of drone and plane-based LiDAR enables monitoring of very large areas of land, and it produces images like in the middle there, which is a very high resolution picture of the structural integrity of nature. That is then overlaid with a field ecologist who assesses the biodiversity and weediness, and the outcome is you end up with a score out of 100, effectively telling you how natural that piece of land is compared to what it would have been historically. What this means is there are tools out there where you can monitor large swathes of the country in a relatively cost-effective way with high accuracy that we think will become increasingly applied through time for parties that are directly own, manage, or interact with land. Next slide. We're also working with WWF Australia on some high biodiversity projects. Next slide. This is a collaboration between WWF Australia and Climate Friendly. The aim is to really move carbon projects, so reforesting areas, into very high biodiversity regions. Traditionally, that's not where these projects have occurred. Increasingly, they are moving into the areas of biodiversity loss and highest nature impact within Australia. There's 5 properties in a pilot this year. We're expanding into next year and beyond to try and really increase the area of land. Next slide. just an example of a property, one of the 5. The outcome of this project will be twofold. It's seeking to improve plant significant areas of koala habitat, but it's also adding around 10% to the total area of a critically endangered ecological community called the Big Scrub Rainforest. So it's just an example of where a relatively small investment in nature can actually deliver a significant regional level improvement over time. And this project also, next slide, reduces erosion and along waterways. It's bringing nature back into the orchards to reduce reliance on fertilizers and pest control. And in the bottom image there is actually the property during the floods. And by reforesting the corridors, it will actually reduce damage to equipment and other things on the property. So this is an example where they can improve nature in a way that's financially positive for the actual landholder that's at the end of your supply chain. Next slide. I would just note that there is a growing services sector in this space, and as I noted, the NGOs really have put years of thinking into how they would love to see nature being improved. The problem was a lack of capital to actually do that, drive that change. So the hope is TNFD provides that impetus, and many of those ideas that the NGOs have developed can be dusted off and reinvigorated through time. There's already a range of products to monitor nature, and it's rapidly evolving with technology. So what will be available in 12 months will be a profound improvement from what is available today. And Australia is in an enviable position. We do have a significant restoration sector, which can scale up at reasonable pace. Many other nations are not in that position. So there is a competitive advantage, I would say, in Australia to being able to pilot and scale up TNFD. Next slide. Thank you. That's all from me. So maybe we can move to questions still.
Great, thanks very much, Jay. I might just ask you a question around data, which is that we're often hearing that the lack of access to data is a key challenge for TNFD reporting. You've spoken a bit about sort of the growing availability using tools and so on. I'm just wondering, as a segue into our next speaker, what role do you think government can play in improving that access to data?
It's a really good question, Estelle. That they're already doing quite a lot in trying to improve the data infrastructure around nature. So certainly there were recommendations in the review of the environment laws that they should do that, and the government has started and is signalling that they will be doing more. Certainly we've been advocating for a data platform that enables more sharing of de-identified environmental data from the agricultural sector, carbon projects and others, so that there's a common public resource is delivered through this work. So that's something we've been advocating for a while, and we do hope that that is something that evolves in the not too distant future. But yeah, there already are relatively good assets, environmental assets out there. The biggest challenge, I would say, though, is mapping of habitat in Australia is probably not as accurate as it should be. So there's certainly some areas where I think state and federal government could improve the information.
Great, thank you. There is a question here in the chat around the time lags. How are time lags taken into consideration to recognise the time between action and impact on nature?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's actually not something I'd thought through for this particular presentation, but there is a delay. If you plant a tree, you do not have a forest next week, versus if you clear land, the impact is immediate. So there, in terms of materiality, that lag is something that I think should be considered, not just assuming everything's equal in 100 years' time.
I'd probably just add to that, Jay, you've touched on the Accounting for Nature framework before, which is a very robust scientific framework for measuring natural capital and changes in condition over time. And so it may take a number of years to detect a change in ecological values, but that is the purpose of that framework. And so to the extent that there are real assets in your value chain that you're managing, or that you can at least leverage a relationship with suppliers to prepare natural capital accounts for, over time, you should be able to, using that framework, report on those changes in condition. It just won't be immediate. And sorry, that's in the context where you're ideally hoping to have a positive impact on the ecological condition.
Couldn't agree more, Laura.
Guy, did you have a comment on that one about the time lag?
No, not specifically. I thought Jay put it really well. There is, you know, increasing amount of interest coming through sustainable finance circles around, Jay mentioned, around new and existing finance mechanisms for investment in nature, whether it be green or blue bonds or linked loans or those kind of things. And the investor appetite, this audience, I'd love to hear from them. If anybody, when we get to the Q&A around that kind of the return expectations, you know, nature it does take time to heal, as Jay put it really well, and that investment is going to have that. But I think, you know, the range of different benefits and services that we derive from nature, there's opportunities to have both those short, medium and long-term returns and values. And I think that can also be built into the time lag, getting people back, you know, connected to country, and, you know, obviously using Indigenous enterprises and businesses as part of that healing and restoration. So there's immediate values, as well as the long-term goal around actually restoration.
Yeah, and I did note on the lag that it would be great to go back 25 years and restore a whole lot of land so it's ready to offset or improve nature today, but that unfortunately didn't really happen. So not doing something now because there's a delayed impact, I think, is the wrong approach. We need to start, and we need to start reasonably large soon to ensure that in future years we actually have the nature improvements occurring where they're needed.
Yeah, and those tools like accounting for nature that Laura referred to can really assist with how we report on that kind of now. I might just ask one more question to Guy, which has come through in a private message from a participant. It really links to Jay's presentation, linking carbon and nature, and also Sally's comment around the fact that investing in biodiversity will actually be one of Blackmore's carbon abatement activities. So, Guy, probably it's the question for you. Have you seen anyone use the TNFD framework, that is the LEAP approach, and also some of the risk, impact and dependency tools for both climate and nature at the same time? As some of the tools that are already include climate, how can we kind of integrate, I suppose, TCFD and TNFD reporting? And is there a potential here for solely the TNFD framework to be used?
It's a really good question. I'm going to prepare Laura to also take a stab at that as well, because I know that Pollination's been doing some really good work in this space. You know, we would really encourage organisations to take an aligned approach. If they're just now engaging with climate risk and climate disclosure, as many organisations are within their portfolio or their investment, then now's the perfect time to take an aligned TCFD, TNFD approach. Many aspects, not all, as Jay and Sally have both touched on, there are clear and important differences between mapping and managing nature risk versus climate. But in terms of the approaches of the TCFD and TNFD, as I've tried to say, an intentional and really important lot of similarities. Yeah. So it wouldn't make sense for an organisation. Wouldn't make sense for one organisation to have a strategy for climate that's looking at their pathway to net zero, and then having a very separate strategy around nature and nature positive. Because as Sally knows from Blackmore, the two, you know, you can't deliver on net zero without nature positive. And net zero is actually a stepping stone towards that broader kind of like net positive impact your organisation wants to have. And for that reason, they should go together. And answer your question, yes, we are seeing that. There's been work that Deloitte's done with hydropower companies, also with kind of retail and consumer goods companies, and also with infrastructure, where they're looking to do their TCFD and TNFD in alignment. makes sense. Same people within the organisation building that knowledge and capability, using sometimes the same resources that come out of that. So I'll give Laura a chance to answer, but yeah, the answer is definitely yes. One quick one. Also, TNFD by itself is also, appropriate. We're not sure the way that this is going to merge and evolve over time. The definition of nature within the TNFD is that nature includes the land, freshwater, oceans, and atmosphere, which includes climate. So we expect that there may be an evolution and a broadening out to include nature as an umbrella of which climate is a part. But that's a bit of a wait and watch space. So yeah, Laura.
I think, Di, what you finished on there, the question of whether or not ultimately what we'll be talking about is TNFD aligned strategy and disclosure with deep dives on subsets of material issues, for example, like climate in the future. I think that's probably where our conversations are heading. And I guess that's also feeding into the strategy conversation. So beyond just understanding risks and disclosing on them, when corporates are thinking about how they then respond to the nature positive and net zero transition, it's about whether or not climate will ultimately be nested under a broader conversation around nature. And I guess the reason for that is because nature is multidimensional, and one of those dimensions that you need to consider, for example, from an impacts perspective, is climate change. It's one of the drivers of nature and biodiversity loss. So you can't do that kind of assessment without understanding the implications from a climate risk perspective. And it means ultimately that there might be trade-offs between different actions that you might want to take to address climate risk that could have an unexpected adverse sort of consequence from a biodiversity perspective. So I think from a future proofing perspective at the moment, now that we know how seriously the investor community is taking nature related risk and how serious it is from a physical risk perspective, best practice is definitely to think about them together. And we are starting to see that as well. So a lot of our work is working with clients on having integrated strategies across the dimensions of climate, nature, and people. And just to add to the fun, understanding exactly how circular economy thinking fits into and helps resolve all of those issues.
Indeed. Thanks, Laura. We might just move on to our next speaker now. I think, this discussion of data is really important. There's a great question in the chat about it, but we'll cover that after we hear from Ari Cowling, who is the Director of Financing Solutions for Nature at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. She's a member of the TNFD Stewardship Council and manages the Australian Government's TNFD work program. And previously, she's held roles in Treasury, working on a variety of things, as well as in the Reserve Bank of Australia. So thank you. Over to you, Ari.
Thanks, Estelle. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, that's perfect. Thanks.
Great. So I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we all come today. I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We are really pleased to be supporting RIAA in its role as convener of the TNFD Consultation Group of Australia and New Zealand, because we really recognise that it's in all of our interests to drive engagement with the framework, the TNFD's framework, amongst business, the financial sector, the public sector, civil society organisations and First Nations people as well. So today I was just going to talk to you about some of the broader policy environment that we are operating in. Then I was going to talk a bit about our TNFD engagement to date, and then our plans for piloting as well. I don't think I need to convince this group that natural capital decline poses a significant risk to industries reliant on natural capital stocks and services and the economy more broadly. Back in July, Minister for the Environment and Water, Minister Plibersek, released the 2021 State of the Environment report. And in the speech that she gave releasing this report, she talked about how she's going to be guided by 3 goals: to protect, to restore, and to manage Australia's environment. And she was also quite clear in this speech that she sees a role for the private sector to help achieve these goals. She quite explicitly said, governments can't do this job alone. We need to work with industry and philanthropic partners. And that includes to supply some of the financing needed to improve the state of our environment. Since taking up her role, she has flagged several priorities. So you're probably aware the government has committed to establishing a nature repair market or a biodiversity certificate scheme. They've set a goal of protecting 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by 2030. The minister's committed to formally respond to the independent review of the EPBC Act or the Samuel Review by the end of the year and bring forward new legislation in 2023. And in the context of that, the minister has highlighted some early priorities around improving environmental data, regional planning, thoroughly consulting on new national environmental standards. And as we sort of talked before earlier today, you can't think about climate and nature as separate issues. You know, the government has legislated its 43% in emissions reduction by 2030 target, and it has committed to introduce standardized, internationally aligned climate disclosure requirements for large businesses. On the international front, I'm sure many of you are aware of the upcoming COP in Montreal starting next week, which our minister will be attending. The Convention on Biological Diversity is a global agreement that guides how the global and domestic communities conserve, sustainably use and coexist with biological diversity, and it's anticipated at this 15th COP. This is a bit of a mouthful, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, I'll just call it the framework, is going to be agreed. So Australia is committed to developing and implementing an ambitious framework. So once it is adopted by the CBD, we will look to update our natural biodiversity strategy and action plan with national targets and indicators aligning with this international framework. There's a lot more going on as well, but I'll probably stop here. I think the point I really just want to draw out is that there is a complex suite of environmental policies and approaches that the government is taking, and the TNFD is just one piece of this bigger puzzle. So why did we even get involved in the TNFD in the first place? Well, we know that historically Australia has relied heavily on imported capital, and that we need to consider the cost of and ease of access to that global capital going forward. Last year, we could see that the TNFD was garnering widespread international support. You know, it's supported by the G7 Finance, Climate and Environment Ministers, the G20 Environment Ministers, and we decided that our interests would be best served by engaging early in the development of the framework. So the government joined the forum, we became a strategic funder alongside the UK, Dutch and Swiss government, and we all sit on the TNFD Stewardship Council, as Estelle mentioned. And actually a more recent development is that Australia's MacDoc Foundation, a philanthropic foundation, has also become a strategic funder and sits on the council. So we actually now have 2 Australian voices there, which is a great development as well. So in addition to this engagement with the TNFD, we've also actually built quite a comprehensive domestic TNFD work program, guided by the following goals. The first is that we recognise that the TNFD is an international market approach, and we want to make sure that the framework, the final framework that is released next year, reflects Australia's unique environmental and economic circumstances and is appropriate for the Australian context. We do want to help ensure that the framework helps drive private sector investment in natural capital consistent with our broader environmental policy objectives. And we would like to position Australia as a regional leader in nature financing. So to date, we have actually run quite a bit of stakeholder engagement. We may have already engaged with many of you through our series of TNFD workshops, which KPMG facilitated for us earlier this year, and also other informal fora, and we'll be continuing to engage with you through the series of workshops which RIAA is organising. We have already heard a lot of feedback from stakeholders, and some of it you've already heard mentioned today. You know, we're hearing that businesses are still grappling with climate, and nature is significantly more complex than climate. You know, obviously the TNFD framework is still under development. People want more guidance, you know, around for different sectors and, you know, what metrics they should use. Many comments on a lack of data or a lack of consistency across data sets, which I think could potentially also be related to comments around a capability and a skills gap to do these sorts of assessments, you know, around nature risk analysis and reporting. You know, businesses have spoken to us about the challenges understanding what's happening up and down their supply chains, the need to bring along senior executives in organisations to support this type of work, you know, the need to think about everyone who could possibly be affected by this type of reporting, whether it be large asset managers to suppliers on the ground, and also a desire for more progress around international targets for nature. I could keep going on, but I'm probably going to be repeating back to you what you already know. But I just wanted to highlight that these are some of the key messages that we have been hearing and are thinking through. But ultimately today we're talking about piloting. So why have I mentioned all of these things? Well, we are running, so the Australian government is running a TNFD piloting program because we recognise the importance of TNFD piloting to more fully exploring some of those issues that I listed above. We really want to be able to get to the nub of the issue so we can understand what solutions might look like. I think the other thing that we really want to be able to achieve is to be able to set examples for how TNFD reporting and disclosures can actually be done. You know, Sally and Laura talked about the Blackmores case study. I think that's really powerful, and we'd like to be able to expand on this suite of, you know, publicly available.
Have we lost Ari?
Yes, we have lost Ari.
Okay, thanks, Bryony. While Ari's coming back on, I mean, hang on a minute, I think she's back with us.
Sorry, Estelle.
Right.
I'm not quite sure where it dropped out.
Just talking about the work that the government's doing on piloting.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we've actually just recently went out to market for a service provider to run a piloting program for us to actually be able to test the framework in practice. We're looking to run a series of 5 nationally, or around 5.
Okay, seems to have gone again. Just while we're getting her back, I mean, from my perspective, it is really great to see the government's ongoing involvement in TNFD, and really pleased to know as well that the government's going to COP15 with a strong level of ambition and has that objective to position Australia as a leader on nature positive financing here. And I think TNFD is going to be a really fantastic part of that puzzle. We might move into a bit more of a general discussion then, and hopefully Ari will unfreeze at some point and can tell us a bit more about the work that the Australian government's doing on piloting. So I might just start with you, Sally, around communicating this stuff within your organisation. You know, we have a number of investors here online today. They, I think, would be really appreciative of some tools. You know, how do you communicate within your organisation internally the benefits of TNFD, and for example, how has the board of Blackmores reacted?
Yeah, thank you. We've been really lucky that we've got a highly engaged and very supportive board and executive team. And I think the advice I'd give to organisations in general is that we've got to do it at the strategic and systems-based level, where we're looking at this holistically and what it means for our governance structure, but not forget that it won't be possible if we don't engage people along the way as well. So literally, as we speak today, we've got 50 or 60 people outside doing our first honey harvest here at the Blackmores campus at Warriewood, because we're starting to use storytelling from within our business to explain the principles of nature loss and the things that we can do to be more in control of our value chain and building up resilience to climate and nature impacts over time. And bringing our organisation and our 1,200 employees on the journey will be as powerful as the directive and support that we get from our board as well. What it means for our investment community is, I think we actually need to have a runway in sharing insights, and as we learn more and we can provide some meaningful context about the implications, which will hopefully culminate in some meaningful metrics where they'll be able to track our progress in a more transparent way. We know enough to know from the pilot, but we don't know enough to agree those metrics yet. But we know how important they're going to be to guide our progress as we go. So I think we'll start off by doing more transparency over sharing what the risks and the dependencies and the impacts are on a runway towards where we can have transparent metrics where you can track our progress.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Sally. I might just stick with you and ask you what value your team, in particular the sustainability team at Blackmores, has actually gotten out of doing this. What's been the experience and lessons there?
So the platform that really underpinned our ability to do this started really when we started exploring modern slavery in our supply chain, because we did use the fundamental approach to doing that to create the framework for engaging a cross-functional team across our business to do that. And probably the second big cross-functional project to do that as well was the building of the financial sensitivity model that enables us to test multiple different impacts to determine impacts on revenues. So I suppose the role for our team is really about being a connector and building the governance frameworks to support that and engaging people along the way. But definitely we see the only way that climate, nature and people-related impacts within our business, effectively rewiring our business to meet our global challenges, only happens when it involves everyone across the business and isn't limited to a sustainability team. And one thing I'll give true credit to the pollination team, we could have outsourced this to them to do it and waited for a report, but they really were very supportive of the need that this isn't going anywhere if we don't build capability. And to build capability, you've got to meet people where they're at. And some people's exposure to an understanding of nature risks, is it what we did in Year 9 geography and science, and that's perfect because that gives us the great on-ramp to enable to understand how we evolve that knowledge and that understanding over time.
Great, thank you. And thanks very much for bringing to life for us that relationship between Blackmores and pollination and how companies can work with the various experts and service providers in the sector to really not just do their TNFD piloting and reporting, but actually build up capability within their own organisations as well. That's fantastic. I might just ask a question now to Jay, and maybe Guy, you want to comment on this as well about the challenges or any kind of pitfalls that you're seeing in this space.
Maybe I'll go first, Guy. I think Guy had a really good point on it's not just ecologists that are important, it's the translators that are critical, and finding those individuals who can bridge the science, policy and financial decision making is going to be a challenge. So there will be training in both directions, I suspect, required to ensure those with the business acumen understand nature a little better, and those with the ecology experience understand business a little bit better. So I think there will be a period of time where finding those rare people like Guy who bridge that divide will be challenging. I would also note there's a large number of people rapidly interested in nature and natural capital. My suggestion would be making sure they've got some depth of knowledge and experience before seeking services would be one comment I'd make. Any thoughts, Guy?
Yeah, there's quite a few that we're seeing, but following on from Jay, those comments is I think a lot of it does. Blackmores are quite unique. As Sally mentioned, they have an engaged board and a senior leadership team, and they already have those champions who just see this as being just core to the fabric and the DNA of the organisation. For many financial institutions, that's not the case, and so presenting that kind of business case upwards in the organisation is hard, and it's going to involve some real just challenges, I think. So that's one of the barriers, is how do you communicate that upwards in a really clear way? To Sally's point around the complexity versus the complicated, businesses, financial institutions are very comfortable dealing with complex risk. So please don't use complexity as a reason for inaction. That's really fundamental. Like engage and embrace that complexity of nature. That's where the opportunities are as well. And if you're seeing this TNFD disclosure as your end goal and risk management as your end goal, then you're looking at this all wrong. That's just a first stepping stone towards actually accessing new markets, new products in nature. So that's really fundamental. And so I think that these are barriers. And the final barrier I see is around, which is linked to all of that, is around perceived materiality. Some organizations or some sectors saying nature, we've got a range of things going on. We don't think nature stacks up as a material issue for our business. For me, and probably for Jay, that makes us fall off our chairs. As ecologists, we don't get that. Every single business, this is core and fundamental to their sustainability. And so not using perceived materiality or complexity as an excuse for not engaging That's probably another thing we're saying. And finally, just organisations saying we don't know where to start. There's so much, and so hopefully today we've started to provide a bit of an intro into things that you can do around piloting to kind of get engaged.
Great, thanks, Guy. Yeah, and I would also argue, it's not just fundamental to your business, but it's actually fundamental to the health of our economy going forward. Our ability to assess nature risk and mitigate that, I think, is really crucial. Now, before we get back to Ari, who I think has joined us again, that question in the chat around the natural capital data and what can be made kind of relevant to investors' decision making. Thanks, Laura, for responding, talking about the different scales that natural capital accounts can be prepared at and giving some examples there and noting what's already available, that there are some natural capital data sets there. Did anybody else, Jay, perhaps want to comment on that question?
I actually thought Laura answered it brilliantly. It's touching on that note that I made, that there's sort of 3 levels of reports and they have different purposes. And the top level of those, is the publicly available information. And I think there will be significant investment of time in government and industry to come up with better ways to monitor natural capital at low cost that will work for the range of needs that are going to exist in 12 to 18 months time. So it's as much as there's things now, but watch this space. There's a lot of things that are coming too.
Right. Thanks, Jay. Ari, we might go back to you. You were just telling us about the work that the government's doing on piloting. I think you got to the point of talking about the fact that you've put an EOI out for delivery of some of this stuff.
Thanks, Estelle, and apologies for the connection. Yeah, we're actually literally in the process of evaluating the proposal, so probably can't say too much other than sort of some high-level information about our objectives, but we obviously will be talking more about what we're doing once we have a bit more to report back on. But yeah, we are looking to run a series of 5 nationally significant pilots across the real economy and the financial sector, and we would like to be able to publish outputs from those pilots because we really want to share experiences and lessons learned with the wider public, including stakeholders like you. Sally and Laura talked through the Blackmores case study. I think it's really once you can talk through the practicalities and a lived experience that these things, that the real lessons can be drawn out and applied. So the TNFD has a deadline for piloting feedback of end May next year. So we'll obviously need to have some results by then. But in terms of outputs that we would like to publish and share, I think Q3 next year is much more likely. So I would just encourage anyone on the call to continue to engage with the TNFD process, whether it just be providing feedback to the TNFD through their formal feedback channels, but also, if you are interested in piloting, I do think we all need to work together to get a good outcome and to share information with each other where possible to build that understanding and capability. And we as government, we want to be helpful and support that, but I think ultimately we'll all have a common goal of improving the state of our environment. Apologies if Estelle has already mentioned this, but we would really like to see this series of workshops meet the needs of industry as you engage with the TNFD. So if you do have any suggestions or requests for topics that you would like covered in future sessions, please pass them on as well. Were there any questions on the piloting project that we're running?
Please feel free to put questions in the chat, or you can contact us directly, in particular about the workshops that we'll be running next year. If you have suggestions for pilots that are really good to showcase as well. But Ari's making a great point there that, accessible information about what has been done and learning from others, as we have today from Blackmores, is going to be really important to give people the confidence to go on this piloting journey themselves. And we might actually end with some questions to our panelists that from a practical perspective about any advice that you would give to those who are starting on the journey, sort of what's the first thing that you would do. Guy, I might ask you in particular, You know, we've got TNFD encouraging companies to start reporting now. So what advice would you give companies in terms of the pace that they should engage at? You know, should they go fast? Should they go slow? Where should they start?
Yeah, I like this question because I don't have an answer to it. There is a real tension between the need to go fast because of the urgency of the issue, and because organisations are seeing the TNFD move very quickly, and they want to make sure that they're prepared and they don't miss a boat before investors start asking questions of them. But there is obviously some homework that needs to be done, internal homework around data readiness, organisational resource readiness. And the TNFD is encouraging organisations to report and disclose, but as I think you said, Estelle, an expectation that should not, and probably will not for some time, cover all of their operations, in the same way that businesses went through a scope 1, 2, 3 journey when it came to greenhouse gas and climate. We expect a very similar pathway. So the first thing that an organisation should do is, at a high level, look at either their supply chain in terms of commodities, or from an investment perspective at their portfolio, and do a high-level heat mapping. I think Laura mentioned Encore. There are some freely available tools that at the highest level, you can develop a bit of a heat map around where those hotspots are. And I would encourage you to do that, have a go yourself. The Encore link's been shared here. And obviously, if you need support, there's other folks out there to draw on. But that's where I think it would start. That also helps to form that information that you then take upwards and outwards to senior management to present that business case, because we do have these exposures, or to your supply chain to prioritise where you need to engage more. So that would be my suggestion.
Thanks, Guy. Jay, perhaps you could talk to us about where people can go to get started, who's out there to help.
Yeah, I would reinforce that point from Guy, that the locating element is probably the one that is going to require the most time and effort initially. So starting on that early would probably be a wise move. And if every corporate assessed their impact on their own land with which they own, that pretty well covers most of the country. So the supply chain is important, but as a first step, asking those people who actually manage land to look at nature-related impacts and track that, I think will be really quite important. So thinking of banks and others that have large penetration and access to the location of properties might be interesting ones to move early if we wanted to get real impact. Does that answer your question, Estelle?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jay. Sally and Laura, from your perspectives, what advice would you give? And then Ari, I might ask you as well if you have any other remarks.
Look, I'll go first. The two things I hear when I speak to peers is that people are saying we're not jumping into it yet. We're just going to wait. We're going to wait and see what sort of washes out yet. And I couldn't disagree with that more. We know that at the moment, as a global community, we are living outside of our planetary boundaries, and that change is inevitable. And the sooner we start to change, the less impacted we're going to be by that change. So if we're trying to avoid things like big cost shocks or regulatory impacts or things like that, the most effective thing we can do is acknowledge and start that journey to change to minimise the impacts that we'll have. And the second thing I think is that make sure that we bring everyone in our value chain and our community along with us. So for us, that means across our sector with our industry association, how do we partner together to make sure that we are bringing everyone along on this journey towards us? Because being a sustainable company isn't a competitive advantage, it's a business imperative for future resilience. And we've got to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind in our own sector and in our own value chain.
Enormously helpful advice. Thank you, Sally. Laura and Ari, do you have any further comments before we sign off?
I guess just in the context of having talked through the Blackmores example, which has hopefully made it feel a bit tangible in terms of what a pilot could look like, I guess I would just want to flag that we've done 6 or 7 different types of nature risk assessments with different clients now, and they've all looked quite different, and they've all had differing supply chains, differing degrees of influence over those supply chains, operations in Australia and internationally. And the framework is definitely flexible enough to find workarounds and solutions for everybody to apply it, I think is the key message I'd probably want to leave on. And it kind of goes back to Guy's original discussion around the different ways to pilot the framework. Even if you don't have really good supply chain data, there are ways I think that you can be valuably applying the framework already. And if you do have great supply chain data, then that's kind of a bonus. But in most cases, I think there's a workaround for some of the challenges around data, and it's still possible to get meaningful insights out of applying the framework.
Thanks. That's very helpful, Laura. Ari.
Thanks, Estelle. I think just something I just wanted to finish with is obviously the TNFD is a global market-led initiative, and Australia has been very engaged with the framework to date, but we really do encourage everyone to lean in, because I think we really want to be able to sort of influence the outcomes. And, you know, obviously nature is a whole level in terms of challenge. It is more complex than climate, and this is challenging, and we know that. But I think, yeah, just sort of leaning in will really give us opportunities to influence where this goes and how it works in future. So yeah, just some very strong encouragement from our end. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ari. Helen, I did see your question in the chat about New Zealand government. I know they're interested and engaged in TNFD. There's actually been some contact between New Zealand and Australian governments, but I don't know what they're doing in relation specifically to piloting, but certainly we can find that out and bring that to our nature working group. Well, today's session has been really fantastic and interesting, I think, for everyone. I might move on to the next slide, Bryony. Oh, there's the plug for our conference. So that's a call to action. Do sign up for RIAA's conference. It's the largest responsible investment conference in the Southern Hemisphere, and we will be having some sessions on nature and biodiversity. But look, it's been a fantastic session. We've heard from Guy the different ways to pilot, you know, from desktop readiness to high-level leap assessments to more in-depth leap assessments. So do have a think about where the first kind of scope of reporting would be most useful and manageable for your organisation. The Blackmores case study was fantastic. Thank you so much, Sally and Laura, for bringing to life the practical realities of this. So in advance of our next session, participants do have a look at other case studies, the Kieran example and the AXA example, for example, on the TNFD's website. And Jay talked with us about the different resources and tools that are available to help with the data and the science. So do start to consider, you know, where your data gaps are, and start to investigate what kind of tools and assistance might be available to you in the marketplace. You know, and as Jay noted, there's more kind of coming. And Ari, thanks for your participation. It is wonderful to see the government involved and for your update on the policy environment. So to those here, do get involved in that piloting that the government's doing. Join the TNFD forum, sign up to receive information about future workshops through Antonia. The next workshop will be running in either March or April next year after the release of TNFD version 0.4, and please suggest what would be useful to cover in those future workshops to me or to Antonia or indeed to Ari. So that's it from us. Thank you so much to all of our presenters. Thank you very much to the Australian government for your ongoing support in running these sessions. It has been a really rich discussion, very illuminating. I hope it's helped to understand how you can get started with TNFD. Yes, we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us.